rain had not stopped for 3 days when Eliza Whitmore was told once again that she did not matter. She stood in the narrow servants' corridor of Ashford Hall, holding a tray of untouched tea, listening to the housekeeper repeat the words that had followed her for 2 years. "Nobody asked for your opinion, girl. Do your work and stay out of sight." Eliza lowered her eyes and said nothing, because saying nothing was the only skill that had kept her safe since she came to live under this roof. She was not a servant, not truly. She was a ward, a poor relation taken in after her father's business collapsed, and her mother died of a fever that no doctor could name. The Duke of Ashford, Nathaniel Blackwood, had inherited her along with his title, his estate, and his debts, and he had never once looked at her as anything more than an obligation written into an old will. Eliza carried the tray back to the kitchen, her shoes silent on the stone floor. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of bread and the low chatter of servants who barely noticed her enter. She set the tray down and untied her apron for a moment, flexing fingers that ached from polishing silver since dawn. Martha, the cook, glanced at her with something close to pity. "You look tired, child." "I am well," Eliza said, because that was what she always said. The truth was different. The truth was that she had not slept properly in weeks, not since the new steward, Mr. Colby, had begun watching her with an interest that made her skin crawl. He found reasons to stand too close, to brush against her in the hallway, to comment on her appearance in a voice that pretended to be kind. She had told no one, because who would believe a ward over a man the Duke trusted with his accounts? At 6:30, a bell rang from the upper floor, sharp and demanding. Martha nodded toward the stairs. "His Grace wants his correspondence taken up. You know the way." Eliza gathered the letters from the side table, her hands steady despite the tightness in her chest. She had learned to move through this house like a shadow, present but unseen, useful but unwelcome. Climbing the grand staircase, she passed portraits of Ashford ancestors staring down with painted disapproval, as if even they questioned why a penniless girl was allowed to walk beneath their gazes. The study door stood half open. Nathaniel sat behind his desk, dressed in dark blue, his jaw tight with the particular irritation that always followed a visit from his mother, the Dowager Duchess. He did not look up when Eliza entered. "Leave them on the desk," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." She placed the letters down carefully, arranging them by the seal as she always did, though he never noticed the small effort. She turned to leave, and for one moment, his eyes lifted and met hers. It was not warmth she saw there, only mild curiosity, the way a man might glance at a piece of furniture that had been moved without his permission. "Whitmore," he said, "is it?" "Yes, Your Grace." He studied her for a heartbeat longer, as if trying to remember why her name was familiar, and then looked back down at his letters. "That will be all." Eliza left the study with her heart pounding, though nothing had happened. Nothing ever happened. That was the cruelty of it. 2 years in his household, and he still had to ask her name as though she were a stranger who had wandered in from the rain. She returned to her small room beneath the eaves, a space barely large enough for a bed and a chest of drawers, and sat on the edge of the mattress until the shaking in her hands stopped. She thought of her father's old study, filled with books and warm light, and her mother's laughter drifting through the halls of a house that no longer existed. She thought of how quickly a life could be taken apart, piece by piece, until nothing remained but duty and silence. The following morning brought new trouble. Eliza was summoned to the drawing room, where Lady Augusta Ashford, the Duke's aunt, sat with her needlework and her sharp tongue. Augusta had never approved of Eliza's presence in the household, seeing her as a drain on resources that should belong entirely to the family bloodline. "I understand you were seen speaking with Mr. Colby in the East Corridor," Augusta said without looking up from her stitching. Eliza's stomach turned cold. "He stopped me to discuss the household ledgers, my lady. I said very little." "A ward has no business speaking privately with any man in this house," Augusta replied. "It reflects poorly on the family name. I trust it will not happen again." Eliza wanted to explain that she had not sought the conversation, that she had tried to walk away, that Colby had followed her rather than the other way around, but she knew such details would not matter. In this house, she was always the one at fault, simply for existing where she was not wanted. "Yes, my lady," she said instead. That afternoon, while dusting the library shelves, Eliza found a small mercy in the quiet. The library was the one room where she felt something like peace, surrounded by books she was rarely permitted to read, but often allowed to touch while cleaning. She ran her fingers along the spines, imagining stories of places far from Ashford Hall, places where a woman's worth was not measured by her usefulness to a family that resented her. It was there that young Peter, the stable boy, found her, breathless from running. "Miss Whitmore, come quick." Old Agnes has taken a fall near the stables." Eliza dropped her cloth and ran without hesitation. Agnes was one of the few people in the household who had ever shown her real kindness, a laundress who had worked at Ashford Hall for 40 years and treated Eliza like a daughter rather than a burden. She found the old woman crumpled near the stable door, clutching her ankle, her face pale with pain. "I have you," Eliza said, kneeling beside her. "Do not try to move." She sent Peter for the physician and stayed with Agnes, speaking softly, keeping her calm, using strips of cloth to steady the injured ankle, the way her mother had once taught her. When the physician arrived and confirmed the ankle was only sprained, not broken, Agnes gripped Eliza's hand. "You have a good heart, girl," Agnes whispered. "Do not let this house take it from you." Eliza smiled, though the words settled heavily inside her. She helped carry Agnes to her quarters and sat with her until the old woman fell asleep, and only then did she return to her duties, exhausted, her apron stained with dirt from the stable yard. That evening, as she passed the study on her way to deliver a fresh candle, she overheard voices through the door left slightly ajar. Nathaniel was speaking with Colby, discussing estate matters in a clipped, businesslike tone. Then Colby's voice shifted, lower, almost casual. "The Whitmore girl grows more troublesome by the week, Your Grace. Perhaps it is time to reconsider her place here." Eliza froze in the hallway, candle trembling slightly in her grip. Nathaniel's reply was indifferent, delivered without pause, as though the subject bored him entirely. "Do whatever needs to be done. She means nothing to me either way." The words struck harder than anything Augusta had ever said, harder than any insult from the household staff who saw her as beneath notice. "She means nothing to me either way." 6 simple words, spoken without malice, without thought, and somehow that made them worse. It was not hatred she heard in his voice. It was total indifference, the kind reserved for something already forgotten. Eliza did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked quickly back down the corridor, the candle flame flickering wildly with her hurried steps, and did not stop until she reached her small room beneath the eaves. She closed the door and pressed her back against it, staring at the narrow window where rain still streaked the glass in endless lines. For 2 years she had told herself that her situation was temporary, that hard work and patience would eventually earn her some measure of respect within these walls. Tonight, that hope felt foolish. She was nothing here. She had always been nothing here. The Duke of Ashford had confirmed it himself, in his own voice, without hesitation or regret. She sat by the window long after the candle burned down to nothing, watching the rain, thinking of her father's warm study, and her mother's laughter, wondering how much longer she could survive inside a house where her presence meant so little that a man could dismiss her existence in a single careless sentence, and never once look back to see what his words had done. Sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it was shallow and restless, filled with half-formed images of her old home before everything had been lost. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and dressed in the gray light coming through the narrow window. There was no point in dwelling on what she had heard. The work of the house did not pause for a broken heart, and Eliza had learned long ago that survival required her to keep moving, no matter how heavy her chest felt. Downstairs, the kitchen was already busy with the sounds of pots and low voices. Martha handed her a basket without a word of greeting, a silent understanding passing between them that today was not a day for conversation. Eliza took the basket and made her way toward the linen room, where the morning's tasks waited in neat, unfeeling piles. She passed Mr. Colby in the corridor. He offered a smile that did not reach his eyes and stepped closer than necessary, forcing her to press herself against the wall to avoid contact. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone smooth as oil. "I hope you slept well." She did not answer, only nodded and moved past him as quickly as she could without appearing to flee. Behind her she heard him chuckle softly, as though her discomfort amused him. It was one more small cruelty in a house that seemed built entirely from them, stacked one on top of another until the weight became almost unbearable. By mid-morning, Lady Augusta summoned her again, this time to help select fabric for new drapery in the east wing. Eliza stood silently while Augusta debated shades of blue with a merchant who had traveled from the nearest town, occasionally asked to fetch a bolt of cloth or hold a swatch against the light. It was menial work, the kind meant to remind her of her place, and she performed it without complaint, her mind still turning over the words she had overheard the night before. "She means nothing to me either way." The sentence echoed through every task she completed that day, through the polishing of silver and the folding of linens, and the quiet apologies she offered whenever she moved too slowly for someone's liking. By the time evening arrived and she was finally permitted to return to her room, exhaustion had settled into her bones so completely that she barely had the strength to remove her shoes. She lay on her narrow bed, staring at the sloped ceiling above her, and allowed herself one small, private thought before sleep claimed her again. Perhaps, she told herself, there would come a day when the Duke of Ashford would learn exactly how much she had meant, and exactly how much her absence would cost him. It was a foolish thought, born of hurt rather than hope, but she held on to it anyway, the way a drowning woman holds on to driftwood, because it was the only thing keeping her afloat. A week passed, and Eliza told no one what she had overheard outside the study door. There was no one to tell. Agnes was still recovering from her fall, confined to her quarters with her ankle wrapped tight, and the other servants kept their distance from a ward who occupied an uncomfortable place between family and staff, belonging fully to neither world. Eliza had learned, over 2 years, to build a life inside the cracks of Ashford Hall. Small moments of peace, stolen between endless duties. She rose before the sun to help Martha in the kitchen, not because it was required of her, but because the warmth of the ovens and the simple rhythm of kneading bread gave her something to hold on to. She read in the library after everyone else had gone to bed, careful to return each book exactly where she found it, so that no one would know she had touched what was never truly hers to touch. Her past had not always been this narrow. She remembered her father's house in Bristol, filled with the smell of ink and paper, where he had run a modest but respected trading business before a series of failed shipments and a partner's betrayal collapsed everything he had built. She remembered her mother teaching her to read from books far too advanced for a child, insisting that a sharp mind was the one inheritance no misfortune could take away. When the fever took her mother 2 years after her father's business failed, and her father followed only months later, broken by grief and debt, Eliza had been left with nothing except a single letter addressed to a distant relation she had never met, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford. The Dowager had shown her a cold sort of charity, taking her in not out of affection but out of a sense of family obligation that could not be ignored without damaging the family's reputation. Eliza had arrived at Ashford Hall at 17, grieving and frightened, and had spent every day since trying to make herself small enough not to be a burden, useful enough not to be sent away, and quiet enough not to be noticed by anyone who might decide she was more trouble than she was worth. It was a strange kind of survival, existing in a house where her presence was tolerated but never welcomed. She had watched other members of staff form friendships, share meals with laughter, exchange stories of families waiting for them beyond the estate walls. Eliza had none of that. Her only real connection was Agnes, and even that friendship had to be conducted quietly, in stolen minutes between chores, lest Lady Augusta decide that a ward growing close to a laundress was somehow improper. On Tuesday morning, Eliza was sent to deliver a message to the tenant cottages at the edge of the estate, a task usually given to Peter, but he had taken ill with a cold. She welcomed the walk, grateful for open air and distance from the house that pressed in on her like a stone weight. The path wound through fields still wet from the week's rain, past hedgerows heavy with early spring growth, and she found herself breathing easier with every step away from Ashford Hall. At the first cottage, she was greeted by a young woman named Clara Hartley, who lived there with her husband and their infant son. Clara's face was pale and worried, and she explained that the baby had been coughing through the night, unable to settle, and that the family physician had not yet been sent for because they had no means to pay for his visit. Eliza did not hesitate. She had learned enough from her mother about simple remedies, honey and warm water for a cough, steam to ease a tight chest, and she spent nearly an hour with Clara, showing her what could be done while they waited for proper medical attention. She promised to speak to the estate steward about arranging a visit from the physician, though she knew such a promise might be difficult to keep given her low standing in the household. Clara thanked her with tears in her eyes, and something in the woman's genuine gratitude settled warmly in Eliza's chest, a feeling she rarely experienced within the walls of Ashford Hall. It reminded her that her worth was not something the Duke or his aunt could define, no matter how many times they tried. The walk back to the estate took longer than expected, and by the time Eliza returned, the sky had darkened with the threat of another storm. She hurried through the servants' entrance, hoping to avoid notice, only to find Mr. Colby waiting near the kitchen door as though he had been expecting her. "You have been gone a long while, Miss Whitmore," he said, blocking her path with his body angled just enough to make passing him difficult without contact. "I trust your errand went well." "It did, thank you," she said, attempting to step around him. He shifted to remain in her way, his smile widening in a manner that made her stomach twist with unease. "Perhaps you would care to walk with me sometime, when your duties allow. I find myself curious about you, Miss Whitmore. A woman of your circumstances, alone in a house like this. It seems a lonely existence." "My circumstances are not your concern," Eliza replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Colby's expression shifted, the false warmth cooling into something harder. "You would do well to remember your position here, Miss Whitmore. The Duke has little patience for wards who cause difficulty, and I am the one who reports on the conduct of the household staff. It would be a shame if something were said that placed your future here in question." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the calm confidence of a man who knew he held power over someone with none. Eliza felt anger rise beneath her fear, a sharp, unfamiliar heat that steadied her voice even as her hands trembled at her sides. "Then say what you wish," she answered. "I have done nothing wrong, and I will not be frightened into silence by a man who mistakes cruelty for charm." For a moment, Colby's composure faltered, surprise flickering across his face before the smile returned, colder than before. "Careful, girl. Words like that have consequences." He stepped aside then, allowing her to pass, and Eliza walked into the kitchen with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Martha must hear it. She did not tell the cook what had happened. She simply took up her evening duties, folding linens with hands that would not stop shaking, replaying the conversation over and over, wondering how long she could continue avoiding a man who clearly intended to make her life at Ashford Hall even more difficult than it already was. That night, unable to sleep, Eliza crept down to the library, seeking the quiet comfort of books and candlelight. She had barely settled into her usual corner chair when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside, heavier than a servant's tread. She froze, tucking herself further into the shadows, and watched as the door opened to reveal Nathaniel himself, dressed informally, a glass of brandy in hand, clearly unaware that the room was already occupied. He moved toward the window, staring out at the storm building over the estate grounds, his shoulders carrying a tension Eliza had never noticed before. For a long moment, he simply stood there, silent and still, and something in his posture suggested a weight far heavier than household ledgers or family obligations. Eliza considered slipping away unnoticed, but the chair creaked slightly as she shifted, and Nathaniel turned sharply toward the sound. "Who is there?" he demanded. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Eliza said, rising quickly, her heart hammering. "I did not mean to intrude. I will leave at once." He studied her in the dim light, recognition slow to arrive, as though placing her required more effort than it should have after 2 years under the same roof. "Whitmore," he said finally. "You read." It was not quite a question, but Eliza answered anyway. "Yes, Your Grace, when my duties allow." He said nothing further for a moment, his gaze drifting to the book she had left open on the small table beside her chair. A worn volume of poetry that had belonged to his own late father. Something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite name, gone before she could study it further. "You may stay," he said finally, turning back to the window. "I did not mean to disturb you." Eliza hesitated, uncertain whether this was truly permission or simply indifference dressed as courtesy. But she sat back down slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye as he continued staring out at the storm. Neither of them spoke again. She read, or pretended to read, while he stood in silence, and after several long minutes, he finished his brandy and left the room without another word, without so much as a backward glance. Eliza remained in the library long after he had gone, turning the strange encounter over in her mind. It was nothing, she told herself, a moment of shared silence, meaningless to a man who had already declared, in his own words, that she meant nothing to him at all, and yet something about the way he had looked at the book of poetry, the flicker of unnamed emotion crossing his face, lingered in her thoughts long after she finally returned to her small room beneath the eaves, unable to fully explain why it refused to leave her. The following days brought new pressures to the house that had nothing to do with Eliza at all, yet still managed to shape the air she breathed within its walls. The Dowager Duchess arrived unannounced on Thursday, her carriage rattling up the drive with a formality that sent the entire household into a flurry of preparation. Eliza was kept busy from dawn until well past dark, arranging rooms, pressing linens, carrying messages between the kitchen and the family quarters, all while trying to remain as invisible as possible whenever the Dowager passed through the halls. It did not take long for Eliza to learn the reason behind the visit. The Dowager had come to discuss a matter of great importance to the family, a proposed match between Nathaniel and Lady Constance Fairweather, daughter of an earl whose estate bordered Ashford land to the north. The union would secure valuable farmland and strengthen the family's standing in society, and the Dowager made it clear, in a voice that carried easily through closed doors, that she expected the matter to be settled before the season's end. Eliza overheard fragments of the conversation while delivering tea to the drawing room, careful to keep her expression neutral as she set the tray down and withdrew. Nathaniel's voice, when he spoke, carried little enthusiasm. only the same weary obligation she had heard him apply to every duty that came with his title. "I have met Lady Constance twice, mother. We have exchanged perhaps a dozen words between us. Marriage is not built on conversation," the dowager replied sharply. "It is built on duty, on land, on the survival of a family name. You know this as well as I do." Eliza closed the drawing-room door behind her and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of the man standing at the library window, staring out at the storm with such quiet weight upon his shoulders. Perhaps that weight had a name after all, and perhaps it was not so different from her own burden, though dressed in far finer clothes and carrying a title that shielded him from the worst of it. She pushed the thought away quickly, ashamed of the sympathy it stirred in her. Whatever pressures Nathaniel faced, he still held every advantage she lacked. He had a home that could never be taken from him, a name that opened every door, a fortune that made even his obligations feel like privileges dressed in complaint. She had none of that, and she reminded herself firmly that pitying a duke was a luxury she could not afford. That evening, Lady Augusta caught her in the corridor outside the family wing, her needlework abandoned for once, her expression sharper than usual. "I saw you in the library last night," Augusta said without preamble. "With my nephew." Eliza's heart stumbled. "I was reading, my lady. His Grace came in afterward. I did not seek his company." Augusta studied her with narrowed eyes, the kind of look that made Eliza feel as though she were being measured and found wanting all at once. "See that it does not happen again. A duke on the verge of an important match cannot afford whispers about a ward lingering in shadowed rooms after dark. Do you understand me?" "Yes, my lady," Eliza said, though the injustice of the warning burned beneath her calm exterior. She had done nothing improper, had sought only silence and the comfort of old books. Yet somehow she was already cast as a threat to a betrothal that had not even been formally announced. She retreated to her room that night with a heaviness she could not fully name, caught between the sting of Augusta's accusation and the strange, persistent memory of Nathaniel's face in the candlelight, distracted and burdened in a way she had never seen before. Whatever storm was building over Ashford Hall, she suspected it had little to do with the weather outside her window, and everything to do with the fragile, uncertain place she occupied within a family that had never truly wanted her, and now seemed determined to push her even further into the shadows. She lay awake long past midnight, listening to the rain return against the glass, and thought of Clara Hartley's tired but grateful smile, of the baby's cough easing under her simple remedies, of the one small corner of the world where her presence had made a genuine difference. That, she decided, was worth more than any place she might have held within these grand, unfeeling walls. Whatever the dowager wanted, whatever Augusta feared, whatever Colby threatened, Eliza still had something no one in this house could take from her, a heart that refused to grow as cold as the stone corridors surrounding her, no matter how hard they tried to make it so. The accusation came on a Sunday, delivered in front of the entire household staff gathered in the servants' hall for morning instructions, and it struck Eliza like a physical blow. A silver hairpin belonging to Lady Augusta had gone missing from her dressing table, along with a small sum of money kept in a locked drawer, and Mr. Colby stood before the assembled staff with an expression of grave concern as he announced that suspicion had fallen upon Eliza Whitmore. "I do not make this accusation lightly," he said, his voice carrying the false gravity of a man performing a duty he secretly relished. "Miss Whitmore was seen near Lady Augusta's chambers yesterday afternoon, at a time when the lady herself was absent. Given her circumstances, and given certain conversations we have had regarding her conduct, I believe a search of her room is warranted." Eliza felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the heat rise in her face as shame and fury tangled together in her chest. "I was delivering fresh linens, as I do every week," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady though her hands trembled at her sides. "I took nothing. I would never take anything." "That is precisely what someone in your position would say," Colby replied smoothly. Martha stepped forward, her weathered face creased with indignation. "This girl has never taken so much as a crust of bread without asking. I have known her 2 years, and I will not stand here and listen to accusations built on nothing but suspicion." Colby's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained composed. "Then a search of her room will prove her innocence, and we can all move forward without further doubt hanging over the household." Eliza had no choice but to agree, standing rigid with humiliation as Colby and 2 other members of staff climbed the narrow stairs to her small room beneath the eaves and searched through her few belongings, her clothing, her modest collection of books, the small wooden box that held the only remaining items from her parents. She waited below in the servants' hall, aware of the curious and pitying glances from staff who did not know what to believe, until Colby descended the stairs with a look of theatrical disappointment on his face. "Nothing has been found," he announced, though his tone suggested this outcome displeased him. Still, given the seriousness of the accusation, I believe it best that Miss Whitmore be confined to the house until the matter is fully resolved. Lady Augusta will wish to speak with her directly. The confinement felt like a punishment despite the absence of any proof, and Eliza spent the following hours in a state of quiet dread, forbidden from her usual errands, watched with suspicion by staff who had once treated her with indifference but now regarded her with something closer to distrust. She understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that her innocence mattered less than the accusation itself. In a house like this, suspicion alone was enough to unravel 2 years of careful, invisible survival. Lady Augusta summoned her that evening, seated in her private sitting room with her needlework once again in hand, though her fingers moved with none of their usual steady rhythm. "I do not believe you took my hairpin," Augusta said, without preamble, and for a moment, Eliza felt a flicker of relief. It faded quickly as Augusta continued. "But belief is not the issue here. The issue is that a ward under this roof has become a source of gossip and suspicion among the staff, a distraction my nephew cannot afford while his betrothal to Lady Constance is being finalized. Your presence here has become inconvenient, Miss Whitmore." Eliza's throat tightened. "I have done nothing to deserve this, my lady. I have served this household faithfully for 2 years. "Faithfulness is not the same as usefulness," Augusta replied coldly. "And usefulness, I am afraid, has its limits." Later that night, Eliza learned the true source of the accusation from Peter, who had overheard Colby boasting to another footman in the stable yard. Colby himself had taken the hairpin and the money, intending to use the theft as leverage, believing that a frightened, cornered Eliza might finally accept his advances in exchange for his silence and his supposed protection from further accusation. The plan had gone further than even Peter expected, twisting into something that threatened to destroy her entirely. Eliza sat in her room that night, the truth burning inside her like a coal she could not swallow. She had no proof against Colby, no way to expose his scheme without appearing desperate and vindictive, no ally powerful enough to challenge a steward trusted by the family. She thought of going to Nathaniel directly, of finally breaking the silence she had maintained for 2 years, but she remembered his voice through the study door, flat and indifferent. "She means nothing to me either way." What hope did she have that he would believe her over a man he had employed and trusted for years? The following morning, Colby found her alone in the linen room, and his mask of false concern dropped entirely, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. "You look troubled, Miss Whitmore," he said, closing the door behind him with deliberate slowness. "Perhaps I could ease your worries. A word from me to Lady Augusta, confirming your innocence beyond doubt, and this unpleasant business could be forgotten entirely. Of course, such a favor would require some measure of gratitude in return." Eliza backed away until she felt the shelving press against her spine, her heart pounding so violently she feared he could hear it. "I know what you did," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I know you took the hairpin yourself." Something shifted in his expression, surprise quickly replaced by a cold, calculating anger. "Careless words, girl. Who do you imagine would believe you over me? I have served this family for 6 years. You have served it for 2, and even then, only as an unwanted charity case. Then I will find a way to prove it," Eliza said. Though even as she spoke the words, she felt the hollow uncertainty behind them. Colby stepped closer, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, which made it more frightening than any shout could have been. "You will do nothing of the sort. You will accept my help, quietly, or you will find yourself dismissed from this house within the week, without references, without a single coin to your name, cast out to fend for yourself in a world that has little mercy for women alone. Consider your options carefully, Miss Whitmore." He left her standing among the linens, shaking, humiliated, and utterly alone in her understanding of just how precarious her position had become. She could not stay silent forever, and she could not trust that speaking would save her. Whatever choice she made, she suspected it would cost her everything she had left. 3 days passed in a haze of careful avoidance, Eliza doing everything possible to remain in the company of others whenever Colby was near, sleeping poorly, eating little, watching the household around her with new and exhausting vigilance. On the 3rd evening, everything came to a head. Lady Constance Fairweather arrived at Ashford Hall for a formal dinner meant to celebrate the near completion of the betrothal arrangements, and the entire household staff was called upon to ensure the evening proceeded flawlessly. Eliza was assigned to assist with the arrangement of flowers in the dining hall, a task that kept her visible but occupied, and she worked quickly, eager to finish and retreat from the growing crowd of family and guests filling the grand rooms of the estate. It was there, arranging white roses in a silver vase, that Nathaniel found her, his expression unusually intent as he approached. Whitmore, he said, his voice lower than his usual businesslike tone. I have heard troubling things regarding an accusation made against you. Eliza's hands stilled over the flowers, uncertain whether hope or fear was the stronger feeling rising within her. Yes, Your Grace. I did not take anything from Lady Augusta's chambers. I did not ask whether you took anything, he said, and something in his tone suggested genuine consideration rather than mere obligation. I asked what happened, in your own words. For the first time in 2 years, someone in a position of power within this house was asking her to speak, truly speak, rather than simply obey or apologize. Eliza hesitated, aware of the risk in what she was about to say, aware that accusing Colby without proof could destroy what little standing she had left. But something in Nathaniel's steady, waiting expression gave her the courage to continue. I believe Mr. Colby took the items himself, she said quietly. I believe he intended to use the accusation against me, to frighten me into accepting attentions I have never welcomed and have made clear I do not want. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, his gaze distant as though weighing this new information against everything he thought he understood about his household. Before he could respond, the dinner bell rang through the halls, summoning the family and their guests to the dining room, and the dowager's voice called sharply for her son from the top of the staircase. Nathaniel, we are waiting. He looked back at Eliza, something unreadable passing across his features. We will speak further of this, he said, and then he was gone, called away by duty and title, and the endless demands of a family that expected him to marry for land rather than love. Eliza finished the flowers with trembling hands, uncertain whether the conversation had changed anything at all, or whether it had simply been one more moment of fleeting attention, destined to be forgotten the instant the dinner began. She retreated to the kitchen, exhausted and hollow, and it was there, hours later, long after the guests had departed and the house had finally quieted, that Colby found her once more, his expression carrying a fury she had never seen from him before. You went to him, Colby said, his voice a dangerous whisper. You accused me to the Duke himself. I told him the truth, Eliza replied, refusing to retreat this time despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. Colby's hand closed around her wrist, his grip far too tight, and for the first time since she had come to Ashford Hall, Eliza understood with absolute clarity that she was no longer safe within these walls, that whatever protection the household had once offered was gone, and that she needed to leave, quietly and quickly, before Colby found a way to make good on every threat he had made. She pulled her wrist free and stepped back, her voice steadier than she felt. Touch me again, and I will scream this entire house awake, and let every guest still lingering in the drive hear exactly what kind of man you are. Colby released her, his expression twisting with barely contained rage, but he said nothing further, simply turned and walked away into the darkened corridor, leaving Eliza alone, with the certainty that her time at Ashford Hall had reached its final, breaking point. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the small table beneath her window and thought through every possibility left open to her, weighing each one with the same careful precision her father had once used to weigh business decisions before his fortunes collapsed. She could remain and hope that Nathaniel's brief moment of attention would grow into genuine protection, but she had lived in this house long enough to know how quickly such moments faded once the demands of duty and betrothal reclaimed his attention. She could go to the Dowager directly, but the Dowager had never shown her anything beyond cold obligation, and would almost certainly side with a trusted steward over a penniless ward. She could stay silent and endure, as she had endured for 2 years, but Colby's grip on her wrist still burned beneath her sleeve, and she understood now that silence would only invite further danger. There was a fourth option, one she had never seriously considered before that night. She could leave. The thought terrified her as much as it steadied her. She had no family beyond the distant, indifferent connection to the Ashfords, no fortune, no place waiting for her beyond these walls. But she had her mind, her mother's insistence that a sharp intellect could not be taken away, and she had the small collection of coins she had carefully saved from the rare occasions when guests had pressed a token of gratitude into her hand for some kindness rendered. It was not much, but it was something, and something was more than she would have if she remained in a house where a man like Colby could threaten her with impunity, while the family looked away. She thought of Clara Hartley's cottage, of the gratitude in the young mother's eyes, and wondered whether there might be other households, other families, willing to employ a woman with steady hands and patient care, even without the weight of a noble name behind her. She thought of towns beyond the estate she had never seen, of the possibility, however frightening, of building a life defined by her own choices, rather than the careless judgments of people who had never once bothered to truly know her. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched her window, Eliza had made her decision. She would leave Ashford Hall, quietly, without confrontation, without giving the household the satisfaction of dismissing her, or the opportunity to stop her. She would take only what belonged to her, the small box of her parents' keepsakes, her modest savings, a single change of clothing, and she would walk away from the only home she had known for 2 years, trusting that whatever waited beyond the estate gates could not be worse than what she was leaving behind. She spent the following days moving through her duties with careful, deliberate calm, giving no sign of the plan taking shape within her. She avoided Colby entirely, keeping always within sight of Martha or the other kitchen staff, and she said nothing more to Nathaniel, though she caught him watching her once or twice across the length of a corridor, his expression thoughtful in a way that might once have given her hope. It no longer mattered. Whatever consideration he might eventually offer would come too late to undo the danger she now lived with every single day inside these walls. She wrote no letter of explanation, left no note of farewell. She told herself this was practical caution, a way to ensure no one could track her movements or drag her back to a life that had grown too dangerous to bear. But privately, in the quiet honesty she allowed herself only in the darkest hours of night, she admitted a second reason as well. She did not believe anyone in that house would care enough to read a letter, let alone follow one. She means nothing to me either way. Nathaniel's own words had made that painfully, permanently clear, and she saw no reason to waste ink and paper on people who had already told her, in no uncertain terms, exactly how little her presence meant. On a gray Thursday morning, while the household was consumed with preparations for another visit from Lady Constance, Eliza rose before dawn as she always did, dressed quickly, and packed her few belongings into a small cloth bag. She moved through the silent halls of Ashford Hall one final time, pausing only briefly outside the library door, remembering the single night Nathaniel had allowed her to stay, the strange, fragile moment of shared silence that had meant more to her than she cared to admit. Then she turned away, walked through the servants' entrance for the last time, and stepped out into the cold morning air, leaving Ashford Hall, and everyone within it, far behind her. The road stretched long and empty before her, bordered by hedgerows still silvered with dew, and she walked without looking back, afraid that a single glance at the great stone house behind her might weaken her resolve. Her bag was light, her coins few, and the future ahead of her was nothing but uncertainty. Yet with every step further from the estate gates, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound for 2 long years. For the first time since her parents had died, she was choosing her own path, however frightening it seemed, rather than simply enduring the path chosen for her by others. Whatever awaited her beyond the boundaries of Ashford land, she told herself firmly, it could not be crueler than staying behind to be worn down, piece by piece, by a house that had already decided she meant nothing at all. It was nearly noon before anyone at Ashford Hall noticed Eliza Whitmore was missing, and even then, the discovery came almost by accident. Martha, expecting Eliza to help with the midday meal preparations as she always did, sent Peter to fetch her from the linen room, only to have the boy return moments later, confused, reporting that her small room beneath the eaves stood empty, the narrow bed stripped bare, the modest chest of drawers left open and hollow. Martha herself climbed the stairs to see for certain, and found nothing, no note, no explanation, only the quiet absence of a girl who had occupied the smallest, least noticed corner of the household for 2 full years. The news moved through the servants' hall in hushed, uncertain whispers before it ever reached the family. Lady Augusta, when finally informed, showed little more than mild irritation, remarking that the girl had likely run off with some common laborer, as was so often the way with ungrateful young women given more charity than they deserved. Mr. Colby, when questioned by the housekeeper, expressed carefully rehearsed concern, suggesting that perhaps the accusations regarding the missing hairpin had frightened her into fleeing rather than face further scrutiny, a version of events that conveniently absolved him of any responsibility. It was late afternoon before Nathaniel learned of Eliza's disappearance, called away from estate business by his valet, who delivered the news with visible discomfort, aware that his master rarely concerned himself with matters involving household staff. "Gone," Nathaniel repeated, setting down the papers he had been reviewing with unusual slowness. "What do you mean, gone?" "Her room is empty, Your Grace. No one has seen her since early this morning. Mrs. Whitfield believes she left of her own accord, taking her few belongings with her." Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, staring at the papers before him without truly seeing them. He told himself the news should mean little, that a ward's departure was hardly cause for concern, that his household ran smoothly enough without the quiet presence of a girl he barely knew despite 2 years beneath the same roof. Yet something about the news unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. a small, persistent discomfort that refused to be dismissed alongside the rest of the day's business. That evening, he found himself walking through the halls of Ashford Hall with unusual attention, noticing details he had never before considered. The library, tidier than he remembered it, books returned precisely to their places despite his own habit of leaving volumes scattered across tables and chairs. The east corridor, where he vaguely recalled passing a quiet young woman on countless occasions without ever truly seeing her. The kitchen, where Martha's eyes were red-rimmed, though she quickly composed herself when she noticed him standing in the doorway. "You knew her well," he said, more statement than question. "2 years, Your Grace," Martha replied, her voice carrying an edge of something close to accusation, though she was careful to keep it beneath the surface of proper respect. She never once complained, not of the work, not of the cold room, not of anything at all. She had more kindness in her than most people born to comfort. Nathaniel absorbed this in silence, uncertain why the cook's simple words settled so heavily in his chest. He thought of the library, the single night he had found her reading in the corner chair, the way she had looked at him with quiet, careful wariness, as though expecting dismissal or reprimand rather than the small courtesy he had offered. He thought of her voice, steady despite obvious fear, telling him she believed Colby had stolen the missing items himself, and he realized, with mounting discomfort, that he had done nothing further to investigate her claim before the household's attention shifted entirely to her sudden disappearance. He summoned Colby to his study that night, questioning him directly about the accusation Eliza had made, watching the steward's face carefully as he offered smooth, practiced denials, insisting the girl had likely fabricated the claim out of desperation, hoping to escape blame for a theft she herself had committed. Nathaniel found himself unconvinced, though he could not yet articulate why, some instinct telling him that Colby's explanations fit together too neatly, too conveniently, for a man with nothing to hide. "Have the hairpin and the missing funds been recovered?" Nathaniel asked. "Not as of yet, Your Grace," Colby answered, his composure unwavering, "though I have little doubt they left the house alongside Miss Whitmore herself." Nathaniel dismissed him without further comment, but the unease lingered long after Colby had gone, joined now by a growing suspicion he could not quite dismiss. He spent that night in his study, staring at the same unread papers he had abandoned earlier in the day, his thoughts circling back again and again to a quiet ward he had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in 2 full years, and yet whose absence now filled the house with a silence he found strangely unbearable. The following morning he questioned the household staff more thoroughly than he ever had before, speaking with Agnes, still recovering from her fall, who wept openly when asked about Eliza, describing the girl's kindness with a depth of feeling that startled him. He spoke with Peter, the stable boy, who confirmed the overheard conversation between Colby and another footman, details that painted a far darker picture of the steward's conduct than Nathaniel had previously understood. He spoke with the housekeeper, who admitted, reluctantly, that she had noticed Colby's persistent, unwelcome attention toward Eliza over recent months, though she had said nothing, believing it was not her place to interfere with the conduct of a trusted steward. By midday, Nathaniel understood, with growing horror, exactly how poorly his household had treated the young woman who had lived quietly within its walls for 2 years, how thoroughly he himself had contributed to that mistreatment through simple, careless indifference. He thought of his own words, spoken without hesitation outside his study door, words he barely remembered uttering because they had cost him so little thought at the time. "She means nothing to me either way." He understood now, with the particular clarity that comes too late, exactly how much weight those careless words must have carried for a girl who had already lost everything else in her life. He confronted his aunt that afternoon, demanding to know why she had allowed such treatment to continue unchecked within a household she claimed to govern with such careful attention to propriety. Augusta, unaccustomed to her nephew's uncharacteristic anger, offered only cold justifications, insisting that a ward's comfort was hardly a priority when the family's reputation and future stability required careful management. "She was a person, Aunt Augusta," Nathaniel said, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it. "Not a burden to be managed, not an inconvenience to be dismissed. A person, living beneath this roof, treated as though she did not exist." Augusta had no ready answer for this, and Nathaniel left her sitting in stunned silence, his own thoughts churning with a mixture of guilt and something he could not yet name, a feeling that had settled somewhere between his chest and his throat the moment he had learned Eliza was truly gone. That evening, he returned to the library, standing exactly where he had stood the night he found her reading, staring at the same window overlooking the same storm-darkened grounds. The volume of poetry she had been reading still sat on the small table beside the corner chair, precisely where she had left it, and he picked it up, running his fingers over the worn leather cover that had once belonged to his own father. before turning it over in his hands and reading, for the first time in years, the verses inside. He did not know, standing there in the quiet library with her book in his hands, whether he was searching for some sign of the woman who had occupied so small and overlooked a place in his household, or whether he was simply beginning, far too late, to understand exactly what he had lost the moment she walked out through the servants' entrance and disappeared from a life that had never once made room for her to belong. Sleep offered him little comfort that night, and by morning, Nathaniel had resolved to uncover the full truth of what had driven Eliza from Ashford Hall, whatever the cost to his own household's carefully guarded reputation. He ordered a thorough search of Colby's quarters, an action that drew immediate protest from the steward, who insisted such a search was both unnecessary and deeply insulting to a man who had served the family loyally for 6 years. "If you have nothing to hide," Nathaniel said, his voice cold and final, "then the search will trouble you very little." The search proved otherwise. Tucked inside a locked drawer in Colby's private quarters, hidden beneath a stack of estate ledgers, Nathaniel's steward discovered Lady Augusta's missing silver hairpin, along with a small sum of money matching the amount reported stolen from her locked drawer. Colby's protests grew increasingly frantic as the evidence was laid before him, weak explanations tumbling over one another, none of them convincing, all of them collapsing under the simple, undeniable weight of the discovered items. Nathaniel felt something cold settle into his chest as the full picture became clear. Colby had stolen the items himself, had used the theft to threaten and manipulate a young woman with no power to defend herself, had very nearly succeeded in destroying her reputation and her place within the household entirely, all while Nathaniel remained too preoccupied with his own affairs to notice what was happening beneath his own roof. He dismissed Colby from his service that same afternoon, refusing to provide references, informing him in no uncertain terms that any attempt to seek employment within the county would be met with the full truth of his conduct laid bare for any prospective employer to hear. The dismissal brought some measure of justice, but it did nothing to answer the more urgent question now consuming Nathaniel's every waking thought. Where had Eliza gone, and was she safe? He called together the household staff who had known her best, Martha, Agnes, Peter, and the housekeeper, asking each of them, patiently and without his usual detachment, whether they knew anything of her plans, any family connection, any destination she might have mentioned even in passing. None of them could offer certainty, though Agnes recalled Eliza once speaking fondly of a market town some 15 miles south, a place her mother had mentioned visiting as a girl, and Martha remembered Eliza's quiet interest in the tenant families along the estate's southern boundary, particularly a young mother named Clara Hartley whose infant son Eliza had helped care for during an illness. It was not much to build a search upon, but it was more than nothing, and Nathaniel found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, driven by something other than duty or obligation. He wanted, urgently and inexplicably, to find her, to see for himself that she was safe, to offer some measure of the acknowledgement and protection he had so thoroughly failed to provide during the 2 years she had lived quietly and invisibly within his household. His mother, when informed of his intentions, reacted with predictable disapproval, reminding him sharply of his approaching betrothal to Lady Constance, and the impropriety of a duke chasing after a runaway ward, as though her welfare were somehow his personal responsibility. "She was under my protection," Nathaniel replied, his tone leaving no room for further argument. "I failed that responsibility entirely. I do not intend to fail it further by pretending her disappearance is of no consequence to me." The dowager said nothing further, though her disapproval remained etched clearly across her features, and Nathaniel left her sitting room with a resolve that surprised even himself, a determination that had nothing to do with land or title or family obligation, and everything to do with a quiet, overlooked young woman whose absence had somehow revealed to him exactly how much his own indifference had cost, both to her and, he was beginning to suspect, to himself as well. He spent that evening in his study, not reviewing ledgers or correspondence, but sitting with the volume of poetry he had taken from the library, reading the same worn pages Eliza had once read in the quiet hours after everyone else had gone to bed. He found himself imagining her there, in the corner chair, the candlelight catching the edges of her face, and he wondered how many other nights she had sought that same small comfort, unnoticed and unacknowledged, while he moved through his own life, entirely unaware of the quiet courage it must have taken her simply to endure each day beneath his roof. He thought, too, of the market town Agnes had mentioned, and of Clara Hartley's cottage along the estate's southern boundary, turning each possibility over in his mind with a care he rarely applied to anything beyond matters of business and land. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ride out himself, rather than send others in his place, and begin the search properly, following whatever thin trail of memory and rumor might lead him to wherever Eliza Whitmore had gone. Whatever it cost him, whatever his mother or society might say of a duke pursuing a penniless ward across the countryside, he found he no longer cared. He had spent 2 years failing to see her. He would not spend a single day more failing to find her. Eliza had walked nearly 10 miles before a farmer's cart, heading toward the market town of Millbrook, offered her a ride for the remainder of the journey, and she arrived, exhausted and footsore, just as evening settled over the narrow streets and lamplit shopfronts of a place she had never before seen. She found a small inn willing to trade a modest room for 2 nights of kitchen work, and it was there, scrubbing pots in a cramped, steam-filled kitchen far different from the grand rooms of Ashford Hall, that she allowed herself, for the first time in days, to feel the full weight of what she had done. She had left the only home she had known since her parents died. She had walked away from safety, however imperfect, into a world that offered her nothing beyond her own 2 hands and whatever courage she could summon. Yet beneath the fear, something unfamiliar had begun to take root, a quiet, steady sense of possibility she had not felt in 2 long years. No one in Millbrook knew her as the overlooked ward of Ashford Hall. No one here had ever heard the Duke's careless words repeated behind closed doors. She was simply Eliza, a capable young woman with steady hands and a willingness to work, and that anonymity felt, unexpectedly, like a kind of freedom. On her 3rd day in Millbrook, she found more permanent employment with a widowed apothecary named Mrs. Eleanor Pratt, who ran a small shop at the edge of town and needed assistance preparing remedies, keeping accounts, and tending to customers who came seeking relief from ailments both minor and serious. Eliza's knowledge of simple remedies, learned from her mother years before, proved immediately useful, and Mrs. Pratt, a sharp-eyed but kind-hearted woman in her 50s, took a quick liking to her new assistant's careful, attentive manner. "You have a gift for this work," Mrs. Pratt observed one afternoon, watching Eliza measure out a tincture with practiced precision. "Where did you learn such things?" "My mother taught me, before she passed," Eliza answered, and found, to her own surprise, that she could speak of her mother now without the sharp ache that had accompanied such memories at Ashford Hall. Here, surrounded by people who saw her only as she presented herself in the present moment, the past felt less like a wound and more like a foundation she could build upon. Word of her steady hands and gentle manner spread quickly through Millbrook's modest community, and within weeks, Eliza found herself trusted with responsibilities far beyond anything she had ever been permitted at Ashford Hall. She helped deliver remedies to homebound patients, assisted Mrs. Pratt in treating minor injuries and illnesses, and even began, at the apothecary's encouragement, to learn to read the medical texts that lined the shop's back room, expanding her knowledge with an eagerness that delighted her employer. It was during this time that she encountered Dr. Henry Vale, the town's young physician, who visited the apothecary shop regularly to collect supplies and discuss the treatment of difficult cases. Henry was perhaps 30 years old, with an easy, genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to the cold formality Eliza had grown accustomed to within the walls of Ashford Hall. He treated her, from their very first meeting, with a respect she had rarely experienced, asking her opinion on cases, listening carefully to her observations, and never once making her feel as though her presence in a room required justification. "You have a mind suited to medicine, Miss Whitmore," he told her one afternoon, after she had correctly identified the early signs of fever in a young patient before he himself had noticed them. "Have you ever considered formal training?" Eliza laughed at the suggestion, though not unkindly. "Women are rarely afforded such opportunities, Dr. Vale, whatever their aptitude." "Circumstances change," he replied, with a small, thoughtful smile, "and aptitude, in my experience, tends to find its way forward eventually, regardless of the obstacles placed before it." Over the following weeks, a quiet friendship grew between them, built on shared work and genuine mutual respect, rather than the careless indifference Eliza had known for so long. Henry never asked about her past beyond what she offered freely, never pressed for details of the life she had left behind, and Eliza found herself, cautiously and gradually, beginning to trust that not every household, not every person of standing, viewed someone like her as inherently beneath notice. One evening, after a long day treating patients through a bout of seasonal fever that had swept through Millbrook, Henry walked her home along the quiet lamplit streets, and their conversation drifted, for the first time, toward matters beyond medicine and remedies. "You carry yourself like someone who has known hardship," he said gently, not as an accusation but as an observation offered with genuine care. "Yet you never speak of it." Eliza considered her answer carefully before speaking. "I spent 2 years in a household where I was tolerated, but never truly welcomed," she admitted finally. "I do not wish to dwell on it further than that, if it is all the same to you." Henry nodded, accepting her boundary without pressing further. and something in his easy acceptance settled warmly in her chest. "Whatever brought you here," he said, "this town is fortunate to have you. I hope you know that." She did not answer immediately, unused to such plain, unguarded kindness, but she carried his words with her long after they parted ways that evening, turning them over in her mind the way she might once have turned over a particularly beautiful line of poetry. As the weeks passed, Eliza's confidence grew steadily alongside her skills. Mrs. Pratt began entrusting her with more complex preparations, and Henry occasionally invited her to observe as he treated more difficult cases, explaining his reasoning with a patience that reminded her, painfully at first and then with growing fondness, of the father she had lost. She began to imagine, tentatively, a future built entirely on her own merit, a life where her worth was measured by her skill and her character, rather than by the accident of her birth or the careless judgment of a family that had never wanted her. Yet even as this new life took root, certain memories refused to fully release their hold on her. She thought, more often than she cared to admit, of the library at Ashford Hall, of the single night Nathaniel had allowed her to remain in his presence without dismissal, of the strange, unreadable expression that had crossed his face when he recognized the volume of poetry she had been reading. She told herself these memories meant nothing, that they were simply the lingering echoes of 2 difficult years finally beginning to fade. But late at night, when the shop had closed and her small rented room fell silent, she sometimes found herself wondering whether he had noticed her absence at all, or whether her departure had simply smoothed over as easily as a stone dropped into still water, the ripples fading until no trace remained. Meanwhile, 15 miles north, Nathaniel's search had begun in earnest, though it proved far more difficult than he had anticipated. He rode first to Clara Hartley's cottage, where the young mother, initially wary of a duke appearing unannounced at her door, eventually confirmed that Eliza had visited weeks earlier to help with her sick infant, but had no knowledge of where she might have gone afterward. He rode next toward Millbrook, following the vague memory Agnes had offered, questioning innkeepers and shopkeepers along the way, most of whom had no recollection of a young woman matching Eliza's description. The search grew more frustrating with each passing day, and Nathaniel found himself confronting, for the first time, the particular helplessness of searching for someone who had every reason to remain hidden, who possessed no family to seek shelter with, no obvious destination to guide his pursuit. He began to understand, with increasing discomfort, exactly how thoroughly he had failed to know the woman he was now so desperately trying to find. He did not know her favorite books beyond the single volume of poetry left behind in the library. He did not know if she had dreams beyond mere survival, hopes she might have quietly nurtured during 2 years of invisible service within his household. His absence from Ashford Hall did not go unnoticed. The Dowager sent a series of increasingly sharp letters demanding his immediate return, reminding him of the approaching betrothal negotiations with Lady Constance's family, warning that his continued absence risked insulting an earl whose goodwill the family could ill afford to lose. Nathaniel read each letter carefully, then set it aside, and continued his search regardless, a quiet, stubborn resolve settling over him that surprised even those who knew him best. Lady Constance herself, informed by the Dowager of the reason behind Nathaniel's absence, responded with an unexpected grace that further complicated his own understanding of duty and obligation. She sent a brief letter of her own, expressing no anger, only a calm, thoughtful observation that a man who would ride across the county to right a wrong, done to a ward he barely knew, was perhaps not a man suited to a marriage built purely on land and convenience. The letter troubled him more than his mother's demands, forcing him to confront questions about his own future he had never before allowed himself to fully examine. She rented a small room above a seamstress's shop, modest but entirely her own, furnished simply but with a warmth that came from choices she herself had made. She hung a single framed drawing her mother had once sketched, salvaged from the small wooden box of keepsakes she had carried from Ashford Hall, and for the first time since her parents' deaths, the space around her felt less like a temporary shelter and more like something approaching a home. Word reached Nathaniel, nearly 3 weeks into his search, from a farmer who recalled offering a young woman matching Eliza's description a ride toward Millbrook on the very morning of her disappearance. Nathaniel rode for the town immediately, arriving as evening fell, and began methodically questioning innkeepers and shopkeepers, describing Eliza with a level of careful detail that surprised even himself, details he had not realized he had noticed and retained, the particular shade of her eyes, the quiet steadiness of her voice, the way she carried herself with dignity despite every attempt to diminish her. It was Mrs. Pratt who finally recognized the description, though she offered the information cautiously, uncertain of the intentions behind a duke's sudden interest in her young assistant. "And what business does a duke have with Miss Whitmore?" she asked. her tone carrying a protective edge that told Nathaniel exactly how much regard the apothecary had already developed for Eliza in the short time she had worked there. "I owe her an apology," Nathaniel said honestly, surprising himself with the admission, "and a great deal more besides. I failed her badly, Mrs. Pratt, and I intend to make what amends I can, if she will allow it." Mrs. Pratt studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity, before finally relenting. "She lodges above the seamstress's shop on Wilton Street. Though I will tell you now, sir, she has built a good life here, quiet and honest, and I would not see her hurt further by whatever brought her to leave your household in the first place." That very evening, unaware that Nathaniel had finally traced her whereabouts, Eliza sat with Henry in the small back room of the apothecary shop, sorting through a fresh delivery of dried herbs by lamplight. Their conversation had grown easy over the preceding weeks, filled with the comfortable rhythm of two people who respected one another's minds as much as their company. "Mrs. Pratt tells me you have doubled the shop's custom since you arrived," Henry said, measuring lavender into small paper packets. "She credits your steady hand with half of it." Eliza smiled, still faintly surprised by praise that came so freely and so often in this new life. "I only do what I was taught. The credit belongs equally to her patience in teaching me." Henry set down the packet he was folding and studied her for a moment longer than the task required. "You deserve more credit than you allow yourself, Eliza. I have watched you these past weeks, and I confess I find myself curious about the household that failed to see what was standing plainly in front of them." The observation, gentle as it was, struck closer to old wounds than Eliza expected, and she busied her hands with the herbs to avoid meeting his eyes. "It does not matter now," she said quietly. "That life is behind me." "Perhaps," Henry said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "But I have noticed, sometimes, a distance in you, as though part of your thoughts remain elsewhere, tangled in something unfinished." He paused, then added more softly, "I do not say this to press you, only because I have grown to care what troubles you." Eliza looked up then, touched by the plain sincerity in his voice, and for a moment she allowed herself to consider what it might mean to build a future in Millbrook entirely free of Ashford Hall's shadow, a future that included a kind, steady man who valued her mind and her character without reservation. It was a comforting thought, and yet, even as she considered it, she felt the familiar, stubborn tug of unfinished business, a question she had never allowed herself to fully answer. Had Nathaniel noticed her absence at all, or had 2 years of her quiet service vanished from his household as easily as morning mist burning off beneath the sun? "I have unfinished thoughts," she admitted finally, choosing honesty over comfortable silence, "about the place I left. Not because I wish to return, but because I never had the chance to say all that needed saying before I left it behind." Henry nodded, accepting this without complaint, though something in his expression suggested quiet disappointment carefully concealed. "Then I hope, whatever remains unfinished, that you find your peace with it," he said, "whatever choice that peace requires of you." They finished sorting the herbs largely in silence after that, though it was not an uncomfortable one, simply the quiet of two people each turning private thoughts over in their own minds. Eliza walked home alone that night beneath a sky scattered with stars, and found herself, for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, thinking not of the future she might build here, but of the library at Ashford Hall, the storm against the window, and a duke whose careless words had once nearly broken her, yet whose brief, unexpected kindness she had never quite managed to forget. Nathaniel thanked her and made his way toward Wilton Street, his heart pounding with an uncertainty he had rarely experienced in his carefully ordered life. He had rehearsed what he might say a dozen times during the long ride south, yet standing now before the narrow staircase leading to Eliza's rented room, every prepared word deserted him entirely, replaced by the simple, overwhelming realization that he was about to face the consequences of 2 years of careless indifference, consequences he had earned entirely through his own failure to see the value of the woman he had so thoughtlessly dismissed. The street outside the seamstress's shop was quiet, lit only by a single lamp at the corner, and Nathaniel stood before the narrow doorway a moment longer, gathering the courage that had carried him 15 miles and 3 weeks of uncertain searching, yet somehow deserted him entirely now that he stood so close to the answer he had ridden so far to find. He thought of Martha's grief, of Agnes's tears, of his own aunt's cold dismissal of a young woman's worth, and he thought, too, of his own careless words spoken through a half-open study door, words that had traveled further and cut deeper than he had ever imagined they could. Whatever Eliza said to him tonight, whatever anger or hurt she carried, he understood that he had earned every measure of it, and that the only honest thing left for him to offer was the truth, plainly spoken, without the shield of title or position he had hidden behind for far too long. He climbed the stairs slowly, and knocked. The knock startled Eliza from her thoughts, and she rose from her small writing desk, wondering who might call on her at such an hour. When she opened the door and found Nathaniel standing on the narrow landing, travel-worn and clearly exhausted from a long journey, she felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, disbelief and something far more complicated rising together in her chest. "Your Grace," she managed finally, gripping the doorframe for steadiness. "What are you doing here?" "I have been searching for you for 3 weeks," he said, his voice rough with fatigue and something that sounded almost like relief. "May I come in, or would you prefer I say what I have come to say from the landing, in front of your neighbors?" Eliza hesitated, torn between the instinct to shut the door against a household that had caused her so much pain, and the undeniable curiosity of what could possibly have driven a duke to ride 15 miles and spend 3 weeks searching for a ward he had once dismissed as meaning nothing to him at all. In the end, curiosity, or perhaps something deeper she was not yet ready to name, won out, and she stepped back to allow him entry. Her room was small but tidy, lit by a single lamp, and Nathaniel glanced around it briefly before his attention returned entirely to her, as though nothing else in the space held any interest for him beyond her presence. "I dismissed Colby," he said without preamble. "I found the hairpin and the money hidden in his quarters, exactly as you told me. I should have believed you the moment you spoke, and instead, I let you walk out of my household and into danger, alone, because I was too consumed by my own affairs to see what was happening beneath my own roof." Eliza folded her arms, guarding herself against the sudden rush of vindication his words provided, unwilling to let relief soften her too quickly. "It is good to hear the truth was finally acknowledged," she said carefully, "though I confess I do not understand why that required a duke to ride 15 miles and search for 3 weeks. A letter would have sufficed to inform me of Colby's dismissal." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked almost uncertain, an expression she had never once seen him wear in 2 years beneath his roof. "That is not the only reason I came," he admitted. "I came because I could not stop thinking of you, Eliza. Because your absence revealed to me, more clearly than anything else ever has, exactly how thoroughly I failed to see the person living quietly within my own household. I said words to Colby, once, that I did not think you would ever hear, careless words that I have regretted every single day since learning what they cost you." Eliza's breath caught, understanding immediately what he referred to. The memory of that overheard conversation outside his study door still sharp and painful despite the weeks and distance she had put between herself and Ashford Hall. "She means nothing to me either way," she said quietly, repeating his own words back to him with a steadiness that cost her considerable effort. "I heard you say them, Your Grace. I have carried them with me every day since." Nathaniel flinched visibly at hearing his own careless cruelty repeated back to him in her voice, and for a long moment he said nothing, simply absorbing the weight of what he had done. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the detachment she remembered from their earliest encounters, only raw, unguarded honesty. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Those words were wrong, and cruel, and utterly untrue, though I did not understand how untrue until you were gone and I found myself unable to think of anything else. You were never nothing to me, Eliza. I simply failed for 2 entire years to recognize what you meant because I never allowed myself to truly look. Your absence forced me to look. I am asking you now, with full understanding of how little I have earned the right to ask anything of you, to allow me the chance to make amends for that failure." Eliza's eyes stung with unexpected emotion, 2 years of accumulated hurt and loneliness rising sharply to the surface, but she forced herself to remain steady, unwilling to surrender her hard-won composure so easily, even in the face of an apology she had never truly expected to receive. "Amends cannot simply erase 2 years of being treated as though I did not exist," she said. "I built a life here, Your Grace. I have work I am proud of, people who value me for exactly who I am, without regard for my circumstances or my birth. I do not know that I am willing to abandon that for an apology, however sincere it may be." "I am not asking you to abandon anything," Nathaniel said quickly. "I am not here to demand you return to Ashford Hall as a ward, tucked away in a small room beneath the eaves, unseen and unheard. I came to tell you the truth, Eliza, whatever you choose to do with it. I came because I have realized, far too late perhaps, that what I feel for you is not obligation, or guilt, or simple duty. It is something far deeper than any of those things, and I could not continue living my life without at least telling you so, regardless of whether you find any room in your heart to receive it." The room fell silent, the lamp flickering softly between them, and Eliza found herself studying his face with new attention, searching for any trace of the careless indifference that had once defined every interaction between them. She found none. Instead, she saw exhaustion, and hope, and a vulnerability she had never once witnessed in 2 years beneath his roof, and something in her carefully guarded heart began, cautiously, to soften. "I do not know what to say to you," she admitted finally. "I spent 2 years wishing you would simply notice I existed. Now that you have not only noticed, but ridden 15 miles to say so, I find myself uncertain how to trust that this feeling will last beyond the moment." "That is fair," Nathaniel said. "I would ask only this. Allow me to prove it, over time, in whatever way you deem acceptable. I do not ask for an answer tonight. I ask only for the chance to earn one, eventually, through actions rather than words alone." Eliza considered this for a long moment, weighing the life she had built in Millbrook against the unexpected, uncertain possibility standing before her, and found that her answer, when it came, surprised even herself with its honesty. "You may write to me," she said finally, "and if your actions match your words over time, perhaps I will consider what more might be possible between us. But I will not abandon the life I have built here, on the strength of a single apology, however sincere. I have learned, this past month, that my worth does not depend on your recognition of it, Your Grace. I would ask that you remember that, whatever comes next between us." Nathaniel nodded, accepting her terms with visible relief, understanding perhaps for the first time exactly how much strength and dignity she had built for herself in the weeks since leaving his household, strength that had nothing to do with his title or his belated recognition of her worth. "I will write," he promised, "and I will prove myself worthy of whatever answer you eventually choose to give." Before he left that first night, standing once more at her door with his hat in hand, Nathaniel hesitated, as though there was something further he wished to say, but had not yet found the courage for. Eliza waited, sensing his uncertainty, and finally he spoke again, quieter this time. "There is something else you should know," he said. "Lady Constance ended our betrothal negotiations herself, some weeks ago, before I had even found where you had gone. She told my mother that a man who would abandon his own household in search of a ward he barely knew was not a man suited to a marriage built on land and convenience alone. I did not pursue you because the match failed, Eliza. I want you to understand that clearly. The match failed because I could no longer pretend that duty alone could fill the place in my life that your absence had revealed." Eliza absorbed this quietly, turning the information over with the same careful attention she gave to any new fact presented to her. "Thank you for telling me plainly," she said at last. "I would not have wanted to wonder, later, whether I was simply a convenient alternative to a broken arrangement." "You are not an alternative to anything," Nathaniel said firmly. "You are the reason I finally understood what I had been missing in every arrangement I was ever asked to consider." She did not answer immediately, though something in his certainty settled some of the doubt that had lingered since he first appeared at her door. When he finally turned to leave, she found herself speaking again, almost without meaning to. "I am glad you came," she said. "Whatever comes of it, I am glad to know the truth was finally spoken plainly between us." He smiled then, the first genuine smile she had ever seen cross his face in all their acquaintance, warm and unguarded, in a way that transformed his features entirely. "Then I will consider tonight a success," he said, and took his leave, walking back down the narrow staircase and out into the quiet Millbrook night, leaving Eliza standing in her doorway long after the sound of his footsteps had faded entirely from hearing. He left Millbrook the following morning, though not before publicly and formally acknowledging, before Mrs. Pratt and several curious townspeople who had gathered near the apothecary shop, that Eliza Whitmore had been wrongly accused and mistreated under his household's care, and that any further insult to her character would be met with his full and immediate displeasure. It was a small gesture, but one that mattered enormously in a town where reputation carried real weight, and Eliza watched him ride north with a strange, unfamiliar warmth settling in her chest, uncertain what the coming months might bring, but no longer doubting that whatever came next, she would face it as her own person, valued fully, rather than as an overlooked ward waiting quietly for scraps of attention. The letters began arriving within the week, thoughtful and unhurried, filled not with grand declarations but with genuine curiosity about her days, her work at the apothecary shop, the small triumphs and challenges of her new life. Eliza found herself, despite every careful reservation, looking forward to their arrival with an eagerness she tried and failed to fully suppress. Months passed in this manner, correspondence deepening into something steadier and more trusting with each exchange, until finally, on a bright morning nearly a year after she had walked away from Ashford Hall with nothing but a small cloth bag and a fierce, uncertain hope, Nathaniel returned to Millbrook once more, this time not in secret but in full public acknowledgement of his intentions. He found her in the apothecary shop, measuring remedies with the same steady hands that had first caught his attention so long ago, and when she looked up to see him standing in the doorway, she felt none of the uncertainty that had marked their reunion a year before, only a quiet, settled certainty that had grown slowly and honestly between them, across months of patient, careful correspondence. "I have come to ask you properly this time," Nathaniel said, removing his hat, his voice steady despite the visible nervousness beneath his composure. Not as a duke offering obligation, and not as a man seeking to erase past failures through grand gestures, but simply as myself, asking whether you might consider building a life alongside me, as my equal in every way that matters, whatever title society chooses to attach to your name. Eliza set down the tincture she had been measuring, walked around the counter, and studied the man who had once dismissed her existence with 6 careless words, now standing before her with nothing but honest hope in his eyes. "I have built a good life here," she said softly. "But I have also learned, this past year, that a good life can grow even richer when shared with someone who sees you fully and values you honestly, rather than simply tolerating your presence out of obligation. I believe you have finally become that person, Nathaniel." His name, spoken without title for the first time in all their acquaintance, seemed to settle something deep within him, and when he asked her formally, there in the small apothecary shop that had given her back her sense of self, she accepted, not as the overlooked ward of Ashford Hall who had once meant nothing to anyone, but as Eliza Whitmore, a woman who had built her own worth from nothing, and who now chose, freely and completely, to share that worth with a man who had finally learned to see her. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Eliza returned to Ashford Hall for the first time since her departure, walking once more through the grand corridors that had once made her feel so small and unwelcome. This time, the household staff greeted her with genuine warmth rather than careful distance, Martha embracing her tightly at the kitchen door, Agnes weeping openly with joy at seeing the young woman she had once called kind-hearted, now returning as the future mistress of the very house that had so nearly broken her. Even the portraits lining the grand staircase seemed to regard her differently, or perhaps it was simply that Eliza herself walked beneath them now with her shoulders back and her chin lifted, no longer the invisible ward creeping quietly through shadowed halls, but a woman who had earned every measure of the respect now offered to her. She visited the library on her second afternoon back, finding the same corner chair where she had once hidden herself away with borrowed books, and discovered, resting on the small side table exactly where she had left it a year before, the same worn volume of poetry that had first drawn Nathaniel's curious attention. She smiled, understanding without needing to ask that he had kept it there deliberately, a quiet monument to the night everything between them had first, however faintly, begun to shift. Lady Augusta approached her privately before the wedding, an unexpected gesture that Eliza had not anticipated. "I was harsh with you," Augusta admitted stiffly, the words clearly costing her considerable pride. "I judged you unfairly, based on circumstances you did not choose and could not control. I hope, in time, you might allow me the chance to know you properly, as family rather than obligation." Eliza, who had learned a great deal about grace and forgiveness during her months in Millbrook, accepted the olive branch with genuine warmth, understanding that transformation, however imperfect and however late, deserved acknowledgement rather than continued resentment. "I would like that very much, my lady," she said, and meant it fully. Their wedding, held months later in the gardens of Ashford Hall, was attended by tenants and townspeople alike, by Martha and Agnes and Peter, by Clara Hartley and her now healthy son, and even by Mrs. Pratt, who traveled from Millbrook to witness the formal recognition of a young woman she had come to love as family. Lady Augusta, chastened by months of her nephew's quiet but unwavering resolve, offered a stiff but genuine blessing, and the dowager, though never entirely warming to the match, could not deny the transformation she witnessed in her son, nor the quiet strength radiating from the woman who now stood beside him as his equal. Eliza Whitmore, once dismissed as meaning nothing to the Duke of Ashford, became instead the very center of his world, and Ashford Hall itself seemed to change alongside her, its cold stone corridors warming gradually with a kindness and attention that had never before been permitted to flourish freely within its walls. Proof that even the coldest indifference could, given time and honest effort, be transformed into something lasting and true. 2 years into their marriage, Ashford Hall had changed in ways that surprised even those who had lived within its walls for decades. Eliza, now Duchess of Ashford, had transformed the estate's approach to its household staff entirely, ensuring that servants received fair wages, proper rest, and genuine consideration, rather than the careless indifference she herself had once endured. She established a small infirmary on the estate grounds, staffed with knowledge drawn from her months at Mrs. Pratt's apothecary shop, providing free care to tenant families who had once been forced to choose between medical treatment and feeding their children. Nathaniel, watching his wife move through the estate with quiet purpose and genuine authority, often found himself marveling at how thoroughly she had reshaped not only his household but his own understanding of what it meant to hold responsibility over the lives of others. He had learned, through her patient example, to see the people around him fully, from the lowest kitchen maid to the highest-ranking guest, and Ashford Hall's reputation throughout the county shifted accordingly, becoming known not merely for its wealth and lineage, but for the fairness and warmth with which its household was managed. Their first child, a daughter named Margaret, arrived on a mild spring morning, and Eliza insisted, over the dowager's mild protest, that the child be raised with full awareness of both sides of her heritage, the noble bloodline of the Ashfords, and the harder-won resilience of a mother who had once walked 15 miles alone, with nothing but a small cloth bag and an uncertain hope. Margaret grew up hearing stories not of fairy tale princesses waiting passively for rescue, but of a young woman who had built her own worth through hard work, honesty, and quiet courage, long before any duke had thought to notice her. Mr. Colby, dismissed in disgrace 2 years earlier, found himself unable to secure respectable employment anywhere within the county, word of his conduct having spread quickly among households wary of hiring a steward with such a troubled history. He eventually left the region entirely, and Eliza, though she occasionally thought of the fear he had once caused her, found that time and distance had gradually loosened his hold over her memories, replaced instead by the steady contentment of a life built on her own terms. Henry Vale remained a cherished friend, corresponding regularly with Eliza even after her marriage, and eventually married a fellow physician's daughter he met while attending a medical conference in London, a match built on the same mutual respect and genuine partnership that had once drawn him to Eliza herself. When he visited Ashford Hall with his new wife, Eliza welcomed them both with genuine warmth, grateful for a friendship that had helped her rebuild her confidence during the most uncertain months of her life, even as it had ultimately led her elsewhere. Mrs. Pratt continued running her apothecary shop in Millbrook, though she took on a new assistant to replace the one she had reluctantly released to a duke's persistent devotion. And she remained a regular correspondent with Eliza, occasionally traveling to Ashford Hall to consult on matters concerning the estate's growing infirmary, their friendship deepening rather than fading with distance and time. Lady Augusta, true to her word, worked steadily to build a genuine relationship with her niece by marriage, and in time, the two women developed an unexpected fondness for one another, bonding over shared management of household affairs and, eventually, over the joyful chaos of young Margaret's early years. Augusta, who had once seen Eliza as an unwanted burden threatening the family's careful reputation, came instead to see her as one of the family's greatest assets, a woman whose quiet strength had ultimately elevated the Ashford name far beyond what land and lineage alone could have accomplished. The Dowager Duchess, though she never fully abandoned her preference for matches built on strategic advantage, gradually softened toward her daughter-in-law as the years passed, particularly after witnessing the genuine happiness that radiated from her son, a contentment she privately admitted she had never observed during his earlier, more dutiful considerations of marriage. She doted on young Margaret with a warmth that surprised the entire household, and found herself, more often than she cared to admit aloud, seeking Eliza's counsel on matters both large and small. Nathaniel himself changed perhaps most visibly of all. The cold, distracted Duke who had once dismissed a quiet ward's existence with careless indifference became known throughout the county as an attentive landlord, a fair employer, and a devoted husband who made no secret of his admiration for his wife's judgment and character. He often told the story, when pressed by curious guests at Ashford Hall's dinner table, of how his own careless words, spoken without thought through a half-open study door, had very nearly cost him the person who would come to mean more to him than his title, his land, or his family name combined. "I said she meant nothing to me," he would tell them, his hand finding Eliza's across the table as he spoke. "I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life, and I thank whatever fortune allowed me the chance to correct that failure before it was too late." Eliza, listening to these retellings with quiet amusement, often reminded him afterward that fortune alone had not corrected his failure, that it had taken genuine effort, patience, and humility on his part to earn back what his careless words had nearly destroyed. Nathaniel never disagreed, understanding fully that whatever happiness he now enjoyed had been built not on inherited privilege, but on the harder, more meaningful foundation of having learned, however belatedly, to truly see the person standing quietly beside him. Years later, when Margaret was old enough to ask her mother about the story behind her parents' unusual courtship, Eliza would tell her the truth plainly, without softening the harder edges of what she had endured. She would speak of loneliness and fear, of Colby's cruelty and Augusta's cold dismissal, of walking away from everything familiar, with nothing but hope and determination to guide her forward. She would speak, too, of Millbrook, and Mrs. Pratt's kindness, and Henry's steady friendship, and of the version of herself she had built entirely through her own effort, long before any duke had come searching to find her. "Your father was not a hero who rescued me," Eliza told her daughter, more than once, as Margaret grew older. "I built my own worth long before he ever came looking for me. What made him worthy of me, in the end, was not his title or his wealth, but his willingness to see that worth clearly, to admit his failures honestly, and to spend every day afterward proving that his change of heart was real, rather than convenient." Margaret carried these lessons with her as she grew, understanding from an early age that her mother's story was not simply a tale of romantic rescue, but a testament to the quiet, steady power of self-respect, honest work, and the refusal to accept careless dismissal as the final word on one's own worth. Ashford Hall, once a house defined by cold indifference and rigid hierarchy, became instead a home defined by fairness, warmth, and the enduring understanding that every person beneath its roof, regardless of birth or circumstance, deserved to be truly seen. One autumn afternoon, a young woman named Clara's niece arrived at Ashford Hall's gates, having walked nearly the entire distance from a neighboring county, after losing her position as a governess to unfounded accusations from a jealous mistress. The girl, frightened and uncertain of her welcome, was brought directly to the Duchess rather than turned away, and Eliza recognized immediately, with painful clarity, the same wary posture and carefully guarded eyes she herself had once worn during her earliest days at Ashford Hall. She listened patiently as the girl explained her situation, offering neither pity nor judgment, only steady attention and the promise of fair consideration. By evening, the young woman had been given a position within the estate's growing infirmary, her skills with needlework and her gentle patience with children making her a natural fit for assisting with the youngest patients who came seeking care. Nathaniel, observing his wife's handling of the situation from the doorway of the drawing room, felt a familiar swell of admiration for the woman who had transformed his household so completely from the cold, indifferent place it had once been. "You saw yourself in her," he said later that evening, as they sat together in the library. "I did," Eliza admitted, "and I could not turn her away, knowing what it feels like to arrive somewhere frightened and unwanted, hoping desperately that someone, anyone, might finally choose to see you clearly." Nathaniel reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the easy familiarity of 2 years of genuine partnership. "Then I am glad, more than I can properly express, that you never lost that capacity for kindness, despite everything this house once put you through." "It was Ashford Hall that changed," Eliza replied softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "I simply remained who I always was, waiting for someone to finally notice." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling low in the hearth, young Margaret's laughter drifting faintly from somewhere upstairs where her nursemaid was preparing her for bed, and the quiet, settled peace of a home finally built on honesty rather than obligation settling warmly around them both. Eliza thought, sometimes, of the frightened young woman who had once fled through the servant's entrance with nothing but a small cloth bag and a fragile, uncertain hope, and marveled at the distance she had traveled since then, not merely in miles, but in the steady, hard-won understanding of her own worth. Nathaniel, for his part, often thought of the careless words he had once spoken so thoughtlessly through a half-open study door, and understood, with the clarity that only genuine transformation could provide, that those 6 words had ultimately taught him more about love, responsibility, and the true measure of a person's worth than any lesson his title or his upbringing had ever managed to instill in him. He had been wrong, entirely and completely wrong, and the correction of that failure had become the single most important undertaking of his entire life. And so Ashford Hall stood, years later, not merely as a monument to inherited wealth and ancient lineage, but as living proof that even the coldest indifference could be transformed, given enough honesty, enough humility, and enough genuine effort, into something warm, and lasting, and entirely worth the difficult journey it had taken to build.